Roqoo Depot presents the second part of our interview with John Jackson Miller, author of Kenobi. In this part of the interview, we will be covering spoilers, so fair warning. If you haven't read Kenobi yet, you may want to pass on this part. Now, with all the fun things that happen in Kenobi, there's still a little bit of room to go forward with the story. Is that something you would like to do, to revisit Kenobi perhaps for another story?
You know, when I conceived of the story, I really thought all along, and in fact, up until I got to the last chapter, I was thinking all along, this is a completed work. There is not another story to be told here. But that said, once I had lived in the world with the characters for a while, I saw some very natural questions that are left open at the end that could be answered. And they could be answered with other stories, and exactly where in the time frame they would be, or who would be in them, or when they would take place. I have some ideas about that. And, my hope is that the book does well and we get the chance to revisit those questions. Certainly there's a lot of things going on in the Star Wars universe and in terms of possible future projects out there. And my hope is that, revisiting Kenobi would be in the mix there sometime.
I know I found myself kind of wondering, I was like, I really want to see what happens to Annalene now,
Well, if you think about it, well, I won't say a whole lot for readers who haven't read it yet. But once you get to the end, I think you'll be able to see that there's still a lot of avenues open because of how everybody ends up. There we go.
We're going to get into some spoiler questions now.
Okay.
So, speaking of Annalene,
yeah,
she's a great character and she's a strong female. But in some ways, she's eclipsed by a Yark.
Mm-hmm.
Who you actually don't realize is a female until quite a long time into the book.
It's about a third of the way into the book. Yeah,
right.
That was intentional. Obviously, we had to go back and make sure that no pronouns accidentally got through, and it was something that was made possible because I had established this sort of alien tempo or alien staccato rhythm to the dialogue and also the internal dialogue that was taking place when we were describing a Yark and what a Yark was doing. It was more often than not we refer to a Yark not as he or she, but as a Yark or the warrior or the chief or the war leader or something like that. I made sure that was kept to all the way through. As I mentioned earlier, the gender roles that existed in the society, that came from previous works, and it's also not clear whether those rules just applied to the clans that we saw at the time or all Tuscans. We just don't know. But it struck me that we would be able to see this clan in transition right now and tie it into what Anakin had done 3 years earlier. And in fact, if you look at things on the map, you'll see that this group of Tuscans lives pretty close to where Anakin finally trapped and killed the Tuscans that killed Shmi. I'm not saying it's the exact same group, but they're all impacted by it. They're all spooked by it because something obviously outside of their realm of understanding has happened. And so I was able to work the fact that this group of people was in distress and really needed a leader to step up, regardless of whether that leader was male or female, regardless of whether that leader necessarily was one of them or not. Their interest in Obi-Wan as a possible Tusken was a really delicious prospect that we threw in there. And as Obi-Wan says, it certainly would be a way for him to hide. And keep
it was a great thing to throw into that book.
I thought it was great, and he even thinks about it and says, "Yeah, that would be certainly a way to keep an eye on the Skywalker ranch there." So that is something that I'm glad that I decided to do that, and I'm glad that it worked. I was really looking for a way to kind of get out of the usual tropes that you have for the settlers versus the natives. And it clearly wasn't going to be the case where the Sand People were going to be depicted as this noble, downtrodden, put upon group, because we know that they're not nice characters. They have a worldview that is antithetical to anybody else living around them. But I wanted to try to present them fairly, and have that moment there where Obi-Wan is able to say, yes, they're this is just how they are, but also we're not obliged to walk into the Sarlacc's mouth just because that's how the Sarlacc is. It's possible that we might never get along with this particular group of people here, but we need to still try to find a way.
Now, through the book, Orion goes through quite the transition. How did you decide on turning him into what he hated most?
Well, the transition, in fact, I think is started long before Obi-Wan even gets there. I think repeated readings will show readers little moments where they realize how compromised Orion already was, how corrupted he already was, how open to corruption he already was, how willing he always was to take the easier path. And of course, there are some echoes to Anakin there that certainly the book plays upon and embraces, that Anakin was always looking for the easier path or the simplest path, or doing what he could do because he had the ability to do it, because he had the power. And that allowed me to sort of on a microcosmic scale revisit some of those issues, because again, he is a charming person. He is somebody who, like Anakin, I think is somebody you'd want to be friends with. And he's not a completely empty person either, as we see when we are talking with him about, or when Obi-Wan is talking with him about farming, about water harvesting. There are several sections there where we realize that he's actually he's fairly good at his job, and he there's a little bit of a soulfulness that is involved there that Obi-Wan finds attractive or appealing, because somebody who is trying to coax the right kind of water out of the atmosphere is somebody who is literally trying to get in tune with nature with these machines. And that is appealing to a Jedi, that notion. It's just that, he is not the success at that he really, hopes to be or wants to be. I think we get more of a sense of how much the real talent lay in Danner, Danner Caldwell, Annaline's husband, in their friendship. A lot of the really good ideas came from him, and Orion, took them and went with them. I think by the time we get to the end of the novel and we see how he has changed, I think we also get to one of the other things I wanted to touch upon, which is that when the Empire comes to town and begins offering power in exchange for complicity in its actions, this is not something which happens in a vacuum. Some people have to go along with it. Some people have to be willing to become its instruments, even in small, tiny planets like this one. There's got to be the guy who is willing to take advantage of a chance or a situation like that. And there is a scene where Orion is rallying all of the settlers against Ben, and we hear his speech and we see his magnetism, which had been used for salesmanship. We see it begin to be put towards a more evil end. And then we start to go back into historical echoes of the fall of fascism or things like that in some other countries and societies in history, how that was helped along by individuals who were willing to turn their talents for persuasion towards these darker ends. So I think that Orion is there to be a friend for Obi-Wan, but also a foil, but also representative of a number of other things.
Well, I was just going to comment. Warren's fate is certainly poetic.
Yeah, it's pretty bad. It's Twilight Zone.
Yeah. Yeah.
It is the worst thing that I've ever done to a character.
Well, and the strength of the story is that you're kind of glad it happens to him by the time it happens, even though you're kind of horrified.
Well, and if you think about it, I don't want to give away too many of the
right.
The thing that he has gotten the farthest on is his ability to talk, his speech, his ability to smile at people, and that's all gone.
Yeah, and in a way, it's a mirror on a smaller scale of what Anakin did to himself, the prison that Anakin put himself in with his choices.
And we foreshadow that a bit earlier in the book. If that's something that some folks can go back and take a look at. That it is something that the story is aware of that.
Yeah. So, what do you think Obi-Wan's defining characteristics are?
Well, I think he's resilient. I think he's got to be put into some of these crazy situations. He's obviously learned over the years that, 1 minute I might be in the Jedi Council chambers, philosophizing and deciding on the fate of the universe. At the next minute, I might be living out in the middle of nowhere. Or I might be, hiding in the closet of a spaceship, stowing away, trying to find out what happened to Anakin, as we saw in Revenge of the Sith. He's got to be somebody who, can take what life throws at him and be okay with it. And certainly, by the time we see Alec Guinness in A New Hope, and his realization, we actually see that moment of realization in Star Wars where he realizes, okay, yeah, I'm not going to come back from this mission. I have to actually go sacrifice myself to Darth Vader. And he just sort of nods. It's like, okay, that's what's next. And Obi-Wan is what I wanted to do here, and what I always try to do is I try to attack the characters that I'm working on along their perceived strength. If you hit them on the thing that they are best at, and then overwhelm them on it, I think that's where you get some drama, other than simply going at their weaknesses, whatever that happens to be. I've tried to do the same in some other stories. I've done Iron Man, various other stories, and I think that the thing that we do here is, Obi-Wan gets kind of an overload of change in a very short period of time, and he's got a lot to cope with, and we keep giving him more and more and more, and seeing how he handles it. And of course, we see how he handles it here.
Well, to me, Obi-Wan is the epitome of a Jedi, more so than any of the other characters. It doesn't matter what situation you put him in, he is a Jedi, even when he can't proclaim himself a Jedi.
Well, and that's one of the things about all the work that I've done. I've mentioned this, that the common thread between Knights of the Old Republic, the comics I've done, Knight Errant, the comics and novel I did, and this, and even one portion of the Lost Tribe of the Sith stories, the common thread is, what does it mean to be a Jedi alone? What does it mean to not have the rest of the Jedi Order behind you, either because you're hunted by them, as Zane was, or because they're in another part of the galaxy, as Kara Holt found that situation, or because you're a castaway, like the Jelf character in Lost Tribe of the Sith was. Is it important to still keep to the tenets even when there's nobody around? And that is something that Obi-Wan ends up having to make some decisions about here.
Yeah, because it first comes from who you are.
Yeah, I think so.
More than what you do, because who you are will determine what you do.
And, Anakin was not the sort of person to make the right decisions always when nobody was looking.
Right.
He was taking the easier path.
Now, in writing Aniline, Were there any influences you drew upon?
Somebody has asked me this in another interview, and I don't base characters on other people. I might base an aspect or something on somebody I've known, either in real life or in the movies or something like that. I might base a voice on somebody or an appearance on somebody.
When you went to write her, was there any specific direction you wanted to go with her in order to contrast her with Obi-Wan then?
Well, I wanted her to have that sort of resilience that he had, so that he could see reflected in her some of the things that he was himself going to have to work on. And as I was saying, we were joking about this the other day. There is probably more of my wife in Annalene than and I have never based a character on her or any portion of a character on her before. But she's been nicknamed the Intrepid Meredith, and we use that intrepid term in this book not accidentally, because I think that there is in both of them that resiliency, that ability to handle 55 different things at once, as she's having to. As Annalene is having to here. No, it's not a direct adaptation of her by any sense, but I wanted to write a character in this novel who was familiar with the ups and downs of life, familiar with the challenges of being a wife, a mother, a business owner, or somebody who had a full-time job and still had an entire community of people, pulling on them. That is again something that reflects and is reflected elsewhere in the story with the other characters. If you want to look carefully, every one of the main characters of this story, the big four, Obi-Wan and Ayark and Annalene and Oren, they are all either parents or guardians, and they are all also responsible or feel responsible for a much larger group of people, and they all address their responsibilities in different ways. Obviously Obi-Wan, on the micro level, he's guardian to Luke, but he also feels pulled at by the rest of the galaxy and his responsibilities to the rest of the galaxy. Annalene has her own children who are threatening to be a mess. Not as big a mess as Oren's kids are, but they're threatening to be trouble. And yet she's also got pulling on her this entire local community that depends on her. She's a local institution. She's the tower of power, as they refer to her. Oren, we see in his own family some of the things that are going to go wrong with his stewardship of the entire region. He really is that character at the beginning who is, he is the face of local, power and authority and respect. But we also realize that, he's got some flaws, and they're going to play out on this larger scale. And then, of course, Ayark. Ayark is a parent and, responds as a Tusken parent would to things, but also feels very much responsible for the rest of this accursed tribe, and they do feel like they're under a curse.
How much do you enjoy reading what you write?
Well,
because I enjoy reading it a lot.
Oh, thank you. When it works, it feels really good. And there's certainly things where, as a writer, if you get one word wrong, one typo, even one panel in a comic book that doesn't look the way that you imagined, it can be hard to return to that book. There are books of my own that I haven't read again in years, because I got so upset over something that nobody else but me might even see. And so when you feel though like you've really gotten it as good as you're gonna get it in a particular story, then that becomes very much a joy to read and to reread and to hear other people reading and hear about them reading it. Kenobi is a story where I spent enough time thinking about it, enough time developing it, enough time writing it, enough time revising it, with the wonderful help that I had from Del Rey and Lucasfilm, that I really feel that this story is as good as I could have written it. And whether it's a worthwhile story to be told, that's going to be up to the readers. But I really feel like it achieved what we set out to do.
Oh, I think it really achieved. It's a very good book. Any feedback I have heard so far is that they love the book. So
the best thing, the best single line that I've heard, I try not to see too much, but somebody said that it's a good Star Wars novel and it's also a good novel, and
right.
if that's true, that's really good to hear, because it's not that Star Wars novels are any better or any worse than regular novels. In fact, I don't think Star Wars novels get a lot of credit the way they should. They never wind up in the you never see them in the awards
Right.
that they do, because the licensed stuff is accepted as, well, this stuff is going to be successful no matter what. And it operates in a different frame, and it's actually a reason why all of the tie-in authors got together and started their own organization to give out an award every year. Yeah, actually, Knight Errant got nominated for best tie-in novel by the International Tie-in Writers Association a couple of years ago. But we accept that what we're trying to do is different, and in fact, in a lot of ways, what we're trying to do is more difficult than writing. Than writing a novel where you're the sole person in that world, in that universe. You can decide whatever you want. You're working in a shared universe with other people and other constraints, and there's an additional layer of people reading the work and reviewing it for accuracy. So it's a different thing. But I try to tell. And this goes back to just about every comics editor that I've ever worked with. They say, don't try to tell just a good Iron Man story, tell a good story. Try not to tell just a good Star Wars story, tell a good story, and then the rest will work itself out.
All right, I wanted to touch on some of your other work. You've got a Star Trek novel coming up that you're going to be working on. In preparation for that, have you read any Star Trek books or comics?
Well, I actually finished the novella yesterday, so it's what I did. Obviously, I've been a Trek fan for eons, and I think that one of the wonderful things is that now that I'm doing this, Netflix has everything streaming, every episode of every series, every movie, it's all there. So whenever I had a question about a particular issue with the stories, I was able to go back to that original material. They also have in Star Trek their own Wikipedia of sorts. Memory Alpha is everything that's in the original material, the TV shows and the movies, and then Memory Beta is everything that's in all of the novels and the other supporting works. And so, I certainly read some of the more recent novels that had a bearing on what I was doing, and rewatched some of the episodes of the series. And it's a fun and different challenge, and it allowed me to do some different things. There's a thing when you're working on Star Wars, you don't want to get too much into technical explanations of how the technology functions. You don't want to get too deep into the weeds about physics and why things happen the way they do. You just accept that Han Solo can fix a hyperdrive by hitting it with a spanner 2 or 3 times. We don't want to get too far into the weeds. Star Trek, part of the fun is getting into the weeds, and I'm not saying we write so that it's purposefully obscure or complicated so much that you can't understand it. But this particular novella has as its springboard one of those stories from the Next Generation, where it was exploring the conventions, and I won't get into what story it was yet, but exploring the conventions of a particular technology and the ramifications of it. And it was a story that left a lot of open questions at the time to be explored. And when I got the chance to approach it, I realized from looking at the other stuff that they hadn't done a whole lot more with it since then. And it presented a really cool opportunity, and also a character opportunity for the players. This particular novella is set in the Star Trek Titan line. Titan is the starship that Will Riker gets to command after the end of Nemesis, the last of the original timeline Trek movies. And so he's on the ship. Deanna Troi, he's married to by this point, of course, is on the ship, and also sort of his foil in this novella is a security officer on the ship is Tuvok back from the Delta Quadrant back in Voyager. He's part of the crew, and they writing them, they have a really fun dynamic. It's much more like original Kirk, original Spock, simply because of their approaches to a given situation, and so it was a fun story to write, and we don't have an actual release date on that yet, but I did enjoy the chance to kind of go exploring in that universe.
Do you know if that's going to be a digital release?
It is a digital release. And
did you watch the original Trek series when it was on, or?
Oh wow, no! Actually, do you remember the Star Trek episode "A Piece of the Action," which was?
It's one of my favorites. I did watch Trek when it was on.
Yeah, "A Piece of the Action" where Vic Tayback is on there. Right. Bella Oxmix. They're learning the card game Fizbin. It's the mobsters. That episode debuted the night I was born. So. So that previously has been my Trek connection. So no, I caught Star Trek in reruns like everybody else of my generation. Trek 2 I saw on HBO when it was in heavy rotation, and then I started seeing the movies when they came out. And so I think I saw. Yeah, I've seen all but 1 and 3 in the theater. So yeah, I was never as far into Trek as some other folks, but I went to go see Uhura when she was in town for one of those creation conventions. I've built my share of models. I've got the big Klingon bird of prey sitting up here on one of the desks, and to be honest, I wrote Star Trek fiction before I wrote any Star Wars fiction. I wrote a Scotty story for the Strange New Worlds competition back in, I guess, 2000 it was. So it was a good ways back. And then I can't remember whether I actually was writing Star Wars at the time, but the first prose project that I actually had green lit was a short story for another ebook series that they did, which was Starfleet Corps of Engineers. And it happened that before I could even begin working on it, they ended up folding that line. And I ended up using some of the concepts from that story in a Lost Tribe of the Sith story much later on. So I am the environmental writer. I reuse things and recycle. But yeah, that was it's always been out there. I have never felt, I was on a Star Trek versus Star Wars panel at one point a couple of years ago. I've never felt that there's a rivalry there that is even worth arguing about. They're two different kinds of space stories, and I think if my own Overdraft series exists in any space, it's between those two worlds where
right.
There's a mix of space opera with the harder science fiction.
Now you've also got Conan's story, Sargasso of Sand.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be in Robert E. Howard's Savage Sword #6, which will be out in November.
Yeah.
Did you do a lot of Conan research for that one?
I reread a bunch of Howard stuff, and there was a lot that I hadn't read because I was not a big Howard guy in high school or when everybody else usually starts reading this stuff. But I found out that there was a slot open on this anthology, and that gave me a chance to go back and read and study, and it was a fun story. It's out of what people normally expect from me, not in my usual comfort zone in terms of science fiction, but it's I think it's a good story. It's a good comic story. It's a good fantasy story. I've not written a whole lot of sword and sorcery style, fiction, but it's not for a lack of interest. It's just not been the direction that I've been going, and so yeah, this was a great little opportunity, and it's got wonderful art by Philip Tan, who was actually the artist on one of my runs, or one of my stories in my Iron Man run back in 2004. I made Iron Man. I made Tony Stark the Secretary of Defense for a year, and he goes to Iraq. He goes to Iraq because it's in the middle of the Iraq War, and so we sent him over there before they sent him in the movies to the Mideast, and yeah, he was the artist on that storyline, and we had not done anything since then, and actually I had not met him until just this last San Diego. So it was cool to work together on this story, and it's fun to have out there.
Well, that's cool to hear. Now, touching on Overdraft, your original sci-fi novel that you wrote, do you know how well that's done? I mean, with the sales-wise, has been enough positive response on that there'll be a second one?
Well, I'm definitely looking at doing more. These projects have a particular life cycle where, for a while, when this particular project was released, it was a serial. So we were releasing it every 2 weeks, about 8 chapters at a time every 2 weeks. And so it had a sales cycle then. And then once it got to the full length book, a new sales cycle began. And actually right where we're at right now, people are able to order both the completed ebook and the completed physical book through Amazon. But it's really in the next few weeks that book is going to start rolling out to the distributors that go to the other bookstores. So it's kind of a staggered release timeline here. And I'm happy with how it's gone. It's something that I did really for fun. I have I have a couple of original fiction projects that are still in the works that are set in different worlds, and one of them is fairly ambitious, and I'm going to be spending a lot more time on it as I get the chance to. And Overdraft is much more fun for me. It is lighter hearted in its approach to science fiction without being entirely satiric in nature. And yeah, I do intend to do more with Overdraft in the future. That's the wonderful thing about having something that is yours. You kind of decide what's next. And so that first book is, yes, it is available from 47 North, which is Amazon's science fiction imprint. And there's also out there somewhere. I did the short story prequel. I put that up online myself. And that was so easy to do, putting it online, that it kind of opens your eyes as to other things that you can potentially do. And there's some other media that I'm looking at exploring as well with that. It's just right now been a matter of time.
Yeah, I really liked how that was released as a serial. That was a very different reading experience, in contrast to kind of a bridge between comics and books.
We really appreciated the attention that Roqoo Depot gave to it. It really was a great help to it.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it.
Well, and you got cereal out of it.
That's true. That was cool. That was very cool, actually.
I debated whether you could actually get like a mock-up cereal made of it, but
I haven't tried. I'm not sure I would want to eat the food any place that they went.
Yeah, some of the aliens you came up with in that series, you just went for like the most bizarre aliens you could think of. Was it hard imagining the ones that you came up with?
Well, what's fun about the serial is it reminds you that the thing is episodic, and that you're looking for a different cool, interesting planet of the week and a different cool, interesting alien of the week. And so, there was a challenge there, because you want to always do something a little bit different. But when I initially conceived of that story, it was as a series of short stories. It was, the original concept for Overdraft was, that it might be 6 or 7 or 8 of these individual, visits to these planets, and it would tie together into some larger, meta story that then would be collected into a novel. it was 47 North that encouraged me to do it as a serial and to sort of move the endings of the individual stories so that we had a cliffhanger. And it presents an interesting dynamic doing it that way. I think that a number of people who were reading the book or reading the serial as it was going along, it was the first serial they'd ever read. And that's certainly, coming from the comic book world, we're really accustomed to serials. We're really accustomed to cliffhangers. We're really accustomed to, come back here next week to get the rest of the story. And I think that, this is, there's certainly a learning curve that's out there for people that are reading this stuff in this manner. But no, I was interested in doing this to see how it went, and it was really fun to be able to have that that project to announce every couple of weeks.
Well, that's all the questions I had. Did you have any more, Jerry Ellen?
No, I guess just a comment that while I was reading Kenobi, I really got the Shane connection.
Oh, good.
I had to read the book in high school,
yeah,
and then I know I saw the movie. I think I saw it the first time it was ever shown on TV. So I was reading Kenobi and really hearkening back to Shane. I mean, to me, it was, this is Shane on Tatooine.
Yeah, I mean, it was well, we don't have the little kid yelling.
right. Shane.
Thankfully.
Yeah, thankfully. But it's and I think new audiences going back and watching that movie, are certainly going to find parts of it dated. But the basic concept, of the the stranger coming in who is running away from something and trying to get rid of whatever bad influences were in his life beforehand. I knew that some of that would be in Kenobi's world, and so I think that. Folks that are familiar with that, are going to have a different reception or are going to appreciate it on a different level, I think.
Right, and the fact that Tatooine really is kind of like an old Wild West town.
Yeah, it really is.
And that concludes our interview with author John Jackson Miller. Remember, you can check out Kenobi in hardcover, digital, and audiobook formats. You can also find out more info on John Jackson Miller at his official website, farawaypress.com. And as always, you can check out RoqooDepot.com for more Star Wars news, interviews, and reviews. Thank you for listening.